As old as we are, the age of this town, over 200 years old now, that we would have had a historical society somewhere along the way in the 1800s or maybe even the early 1900s. But in all of the research that I've done, I've never been able to find any evidence that we ever had a historical society as such here in New Carlisle. We had a lot of historians, we really did. And maybe that was the reason that they never really organized. You have to keep in mind, too, that New Carlisle was a very small community. Up until World War II, we were still a small rural community. And it wasn't until after the war, really, when we began to grow, this town began to grow. And as a result of that growth, it was changed in its appearance and the way, and I'm not talking about the physical appearance, but in the appearance of the way in which the community, I suppose I should say the way in which the community, the population of the community, it was an entirely different kind of, early on it was strictly a farm community. And when the farmers would finish up their business out in the, and wanted to retire, they retired in New Carlisle. That's how many of the farmers come into town here after they had completed their years of service. Maybe their son took the business over, but many of them came to town. But at any rate, there were local historians, and probably one of the very first local historians was a doctor by the name of H.H. Young, Harry H. Young. He came here shortly after the Civil War and became extremely interested in the history. And if any of you have ever read Beer's history, 1881 history, it's a book about that thick, and Beers wrote about most all of Clark County. It wasn't just New Carlisle, but about the county. It's Harry Young who gives the history pretty much of New Carlisle. If you read what he details in there, it's the history of town. And so a lot of what later historians picked up were from Mr. Young. But then the one that I really think was probably the most prolific of our historians, of those early historians, was a man by the name of Ed Williams, who was the editor of the New Carlisle paper for a number of years. Ed Williams was very prolific in terms of the history that he wrote in the papers. Unfortunately, it's a real shame that we weren't able to retain a lot of those early New Carlisle Sun papers. The story I was told about that, just an aside, at one time, it's my understanding that they had all of the New Carlisle Suns, or the majority of the New Carlisle Suns, in the office down where it was located down on South Main, that went back into the late 1800s. They maintained those. I don't know whether this is true, but I was always told that after Mr. Mount sold the business to Bulling Mormon, that they came in, all of that went out. A shame. If that is true. I don't know that it is, but that's the story I was told. So we lost a lot of news. There are a lot of individual papers that people have given to us, some of which we have boxed up in the library back here that people are entitled to look at if they wear gloves, and some of them are very fragile. But we do have a lot of New Carlisle papers, or a number of New Carlisle papers still in existence, but they're very sporadic. They were very sporadic. But Ed Williams did write a lot of history of the early New Carlisle. And the thing you've got to keep in mind with history, this is again another one of those things, is that where's my good friend Dave back there? We keep finding, Dave keeps coming up with new things that change the story a little bit here and change the story a little bit here. And that's what history is. History just builds and builds and builds. It never is complete. And there's some things that we will never know for sure about the history of this town or about the individuals of this town. We may, just like Dave found some new things about John Paul that he was telling me about today that I was not aware about. And that's what you'll do. You'll get bits and pieces, but you'll never really know for sure as to the stories.
I have a question. Have any of the papers been scanned before they deteriorate?
No, they haven't. And that's interesting. Just another quick aside, we do have a new librarian coming on who's already on the job here. And I had a chance to talk with her the other day, and it's my understanding that she's very much interested in digitizing everything that we have back here. She wants to go big. Obviously, that's not an inexpensive proposition. First of all, you need equipment. Second of all, you need volunteers probably or help to do that kind of work, because that's not easy. You've got a lot of things to digitize. But if they move, and I hope they do in time, we're able to do that, that would be wonderful. Because we know today we live in an age of technology. Everybody wants to get on the computer, and that's all that kind of thing should be. You know, where you can simply go to the computer and sit down, and you want to find out something about New Carlisle or some other area, it's there. You can dig it out. That's, I think, the idea of our new director, and it's not something that's going to happen in the next year or so. It's going to be a process to build upon. But I hope that we can accomplish that, because her idea is hoping we can pull the Historical Society and the library closer together in terms of the material that we have, and be able to share and work with one another in doing things like that. Let's get back to the historical societies. The first historical society that I'm aware of, and I've done a lot of research, do a lot of reading, occurred in 1973. Not very long ago when you stop and think about time. And the reason that a group of New Carlisle people got together to create that historical society at that time was the John Paul House. It was at a time when the property was up for sale, and the Historical Society individuals who were interested in starting the group were aware of that. This was at the time when Mr. Gastineau had purchased the land from John Sheep, and John Sheep was the last owner before Mr. Gastineau purchased the property. And it was Mr. Gastineau's intent to put homes out there. And so our concern at that time, the people who were interested in the Historical Society, what's going to happen to the John Paul House? So a group got together, find my place here. The first meeting was October 21st, 1973. And a group of probably about 25, 30 people got together, and I was one of those. But I want to tell you right up front, I wasn't really that active at that time because I was still in the education business. But I was a member of the organization. But they got together and organized themselves and became very active. And at one point in time, we had probably up close to 100 people in New Carlisle who were actually on a list. Now, not all of those people were attending all meetings, but by being on the list of interested people, they were there because they wanted to see the property maintained and saved, if that was at all possible. Well, just to throw out a couple of names, Jane and George Harold, who I know many of you do know, were active in that organization. Jane was the vice president. A fellow by the name of Leonard Kaus, who I know some of you know. Leonard was the president. Leonard was very active. By the way, Leonard Kaus was on the 1940 state basketball championship team from New Carlisle. So everybody knew Leonard Kaus. He was a good ball player. I never saw him play, but I know he was a good ball player because they won the state championship. He was president. Jane Harold was vice president. And they really got the group together and really moved forward. But almost from the beginning, we began to meet some obstacles. Probably the first thing we did was to go after our incorporation papers from the state of Ohio, which we got very easily. At the same time, we applied for a 501c3 again. John Prokachik, I think it was John Prokachik. No, it wasn't. I'm sorry about that. Jim Gorman. Jim Gorman helped us through that process. And I know many of you know Attorney Gorman, who lived here in our community. So we received those things quickly. But almost immediately, one of the property owners that lived at that time right around the curve as you go out Carlisle Pike and lived back the lane before you hit the second curve. There's a house back there. He slapped an injunction upon the Historical Society because he didn't want people traveling back his lane, and that was the most accessible way to get back to the John Paul house, was to go back that lane. Well, that tied us up for quite a period of time. Actually, it was in almost a year before we worked our way through that issue. During that interim, while we were very careful, we went other ways. You had to pretty much walk back. If you go out past the swimming pool, there's another lane that you can see if you look to your left, back through the woods. You can see that area. That's how many of us would get back there at the time. During this, the gentleman didn't want us coming down his lane. We did a lot of work back there. The house was in good shape. Really it was. In 1973, the house was in fairly good shape. It needed attention. One of the first things we did, is there anybody that was involved with us with that? Okay. One of the first things we did was clean it up, wasn't it? Went out there, we cleaned the area up. It really looked nice around the house, and even inside the house. We've got pictures somewhere, I think I brought some tonight, that show people sweeping in the house and doing all kinds of jobs like that. We really were doing our part to maintain the place and to save it. Anyway, that became a problem, and it took us a year to work through the property issue. We won. He was unable to, his suit against us did not hold, the court ruled in our favor. But then the next thing we run into was an issue that Mr. Gastineau in the city, he wanted to put 95 homes, 90 or 95 homes on that, on the area there. City refused to allow that because the properties would have been too small. They were, I think the ruling that came out was they expected 3 acres of land for each property, and if you took 3 acres of land with the acreage that was there, it would have allowed about 35 homes, which is approximately, that's the way they're heading right now. The other issue was water and sewage. They would have had to have water, sewage, every home. Well, that was a problem. Well, one thing led to another through that period of time. This was going on from 1973, 74, right on up through the end of the 70s. And we never could get it to move any further forward. Another major issue, obviously at that time, was we were trying to raise funds from the community and in other ways to do some renovations in the building. So money became a problem. Always money, isn't it? That's always seems to be a problem when you're looking at trying to the issue we're running into with the Little Olive Branch School. We'll whip that one of these days, though. I believe we will. It's just going to take some time. But that happened to us, so we just weren't moving forward. And unfortunately, Mr. Gastineau was trying to push us a little bit to get the job done. I mean, if we were going to do something with the property. Well, there were members of our society, I think, that were a little bit afraid to go too far forward. And in 1980, one of our members at that time made a motion on the floor that we return the easement back to Mr. Gastineau, and we give this project up. Well, there were obviously some people that didn't agree with that, but it was approved. And so by 1981, the Historical Society was no longer, and the property was back in Mr. Gastineau's hand. And unfortunately, that is when the deterioration of the house began in earnest. There was another problem I forgot to mention in there, and I think, John, some of you will remember this, that vandalism became a problem. And there was a beautiful barn back there that was built with the huge timbers, like they built back in the 1800s. The kids got into that barn and burned it down. Oh. It was torn down, had to be torn down after a point, but the fire had destroyed most of it. That was a real disaster. Because I think that happened while we were still in progress trying to move forward with the house, and I think that discouraged some of our members. And so, again, just another reason that we just couldn't seem to get it off the ground. And so the Historical Society went out of business in 1981. Okay, fast forward. In the late 1990s, Jim Kaplinger, who was our city manager at that time, approached some of the older members from the original group who were still living here in town to see if we might be willing to reorganize the New Carlisle Historical Society, rejuvenate our 501c3, be reincorporated again, so that we might help the Clark County Retired Teachers Association with a project that they had in mind for the little advanced school building out here east of town. Well, we met and discussed that issue and decided that that seemed like a worthwhile cause with the ideas that they had for the building. And so we organized in 1998, I believe it was, Bev Quim, pastor of